As a filmmaker, whether you already have some experience or you're just getting started, at some point you're going to need to use some sort of filters in front of your lenses. When we're talking about lens filters, there are a ton of different options out there, and each of them has its own specific use cases and gives you different results. And that's kind of why this entire topic could be overwhelming to a lot of people, especially if you're a beginner. Just to be clear, this isn't going to be a video about every single type of lens filter there is out there, because I'd like to try to keep it under 6 hours, but we are talking about the main lens filters that I think you should know of as a filmmaker, because they're probably going to be the ones that you end up using the most often anyways. Now, first up, there are two main categories that I would personally split up all of these filters across, and they are going to be utility filters and creative filters. Utility filters are the ones that you use to get some sort of technical benefit. So stuff like being able to control exposure or getting rid of something in your image that's distracting. And creative filters are more meant for when you want to give your footage a specific look. So an easy way to think about it would be utility filters usually take something away from your image and creative filters add something to it. So the first filter we're talking about fits into the utility category, and it's going to be a neutral density filter, or an ND for short. These basically give you another way to control exposure instead of having to mess with your in-camera settings like shutter speed or aperture. An ND filter is essentially a piece of glass that goes on the front of your lens, and it takes away some of the light going into it and hitting your sensor. As much as I hate the cliche that most of you have probably already heard thousands of times before, ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera. Now, there are a couple of different types of ND filters. There is fixed NDs, variable NDs, and graduated NDs. NDs nuts. Fucking stupid. The fixed ones have a fixed amount of light that they stop, and they come in a bunch of different strengths. They're great at what they do, but they have one major drawback, and that is that if you're working on a project solo or in a very small team, having to constantly swap between different strength ND filters whenever you need more or less light hitting your sensor can really slow you down on set. This can be especially annoying if you're really short on time or if you're working in a really fast-paced environment, and that's kind of where variable ND filters come in. These are used for pretty much the same thing as fixed NDs, except with variable ND filters you have a range of light reduction that you can control by rotating them. Turning them to one side or the other lets in more or less light, and it's basically like you have a couple of different fixed NDs all packed into one. A variable ND is going to be much more convenient for people who don't want to constantly be swapping across different filters. That being said, they do also have some drawbacks as well. Like, for example, with some variable ND filters, you might notice that you get like an unwanted color cast across your image. For example, right now for this video, I'm using a variable ND filter on my lens, and usually this one gives me a little bit of a yellow color cast, which honestly I kind of like for the way that it makes skin look, but even if I didn't, it's not really that strong, so if I wanted to, I could just remove it when I'm color grading the video later. Something else you might run into is the occasional dark cross across your image that happens when you turn your variable ND way too far, but to be honest, that's more of a problem when you buy really like super cheap variable NDs. Luckily, nowadays, even some of the more budget-oriented brands that make filters have kind of found ways to cut down on some of those problems. Finally, there's graduated ND filters, and they do pretty much the exact same thing as the other two types, except instead of reducing light across your entire frame, they only do it for part of it. Full disclosure, in all of my time as a filmmaker and photographer so far, I have never used a graduated ND filter, and that's not to say that they're like bad or anything, I just personally haven't ever had the need to. But if you've ever found yourself looking at your image and thinking, man, I really wish I could only make half of it darker, maybe you want to look into these. Either way, at this point as a solo filmmaker, my go-to is pretty much always some sort of variable ND. The next filter is also in the utility category, and it's a circular polarizer, or a CPL for short. Now, this one is going to be much easier and faster to explain, and it's basically a filter that takes away some of the unwanted reflections or glare off of the surfaces of objects, and it can also take away some of the haze in your shot. Kind of like with a variable ND, you can turn it until you get to the sweet spot where you notice that it's starting to take away some of those unwanted distractions, but that being said, it also has its limitations. Depending on what angle you're shooting at, you might notice that you're not able to get rid of like absolutely all of the reflections in your image, so that is something to keep in mind. It is a really useful filter, but it's not like magic or anything. Aside from getting rid of some of the stuff I just mentioned, using a CPL filter can also help you to get more contrast, and it can help to make the colors in your footage look more saturated. Obviously, if there's not like a bright reflection on the surface of something, you actually get to see what color it's supposed to be. It works really well for making something like a blue sky or green leaves look more vibrant. One last thing to mention is that while a CPL can be really useful, you might not want to use one all the time. Sometimes reflections and glare might be something that you're going for intentionally for creative effect, and in those cases you might want to hold off on using it. Finally, we're going to talk about a type of filter that falls into the creative category, and that's going to be diffusion filters. And notice how I'm not naming a specific one. That's because diffusion filters come in a bunch of different options, and each of them has its own different properties. Like, even if my life depended on it right now, I definitely couldn't name absolutely every single one of them. Luckily, I don't have to, because a company called Tiffin created this really useful resource that's supposed to show you what different diffusion filters are supposed to do to your image. Keep in mind, this triangle was made specifically for Tiffin filters. That being said, pretty much every brand that makes diffusion filters nowadays kind of follows the same rules in terms of how they make them, so even if you don't go with a filter from Tiffin and instead you choose a different brand, there should still be a lot of carryover from this diagram to what that filter is supposed to do. Some of these filters are meant to increase halation, which is basically the bloom around the highlights in your image. Others reduce contrast, and then there are some filters that are meant to kind of make your image look a little bit softer without really impacting any of the important details. And of course, there are some filters that combine some or all of these effects to kind of give you the look that you're after. To give you an example, in a lot of my videos lately, I've always been using a black mist filter, which is kind of towards the top left of the triangle. Now, my filter isn't by Tiffin, it's from a different brand, and because of that, it might perform a little bit differently than what you would expect by looking at the diagram. If I show you a shot without it and then a shot with it, you should be able to clearly notice what it does. And it is still pretty close to what you would expect from the triangle. The lights in the background have a bit of a glow around them, the contrast is lower, and the overall image is just a little bit softer without really losing out on any of the details. This is what it looks like, and if you look closely, you should be able to see all of these small speckles on it, and no, that's not because I don't clean my gear. That's just how it's made, and all of these little speckles are actually what makes the footage look the way that it does whenever I'm using the filter. I don't really know about you, but I personally really like the way that it makes my footage look, and that's kind of why it's almost always on one of my lenses. Alright, so, like I said at the start of the video, I think that these are the most common lens filters that you should know about as a filmmaker. There are obviously a bunch of other ones that we didn't talk about in this video, but maybe at some point down the line we will, so if you're interested in that, you might want to subscribe to stick around. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and you were able to learn something new. If you've got any questions, you can drop them in the comments and I'll try to get back to you. As always, thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one.